Just a heads up. I know I talked about, I know that, what was the Dustinator yesterday, talked about my Slido workflow. Basically, I've got my Slido questions here that will come up that we'll check in on like every 20, 30 minutes or so. So usually what I do is I teach for 20, 25 minutes. We'll look at questions for 5 or so minutes, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. So that's kind of the workflow for all my classes, for all my lectures. There is a moderator that is moderating on Slido. So if you have questions that don't make it to my view here, they've been posted in the channel. And I don't know if we're doing, I think we're just posting them in the channel. Winnie or Tyler, let me know if that's false. We may have a thread for those. Also, there are a lot of times where I ask you questions. Okay, so they'll just be posted here in the channel. Perfect. So if you don't see your question, then look for it with the red question mark in the channel here. A lot of times I ask you questions and I want you to respond and answer, or if we do like driver navigator and you're walking me through how to build something, just come up. We're going to have that thread here where I post the Slido and Zoom links every day. So let me pin this and go back to my thread. So this will be the lecture thread here. So you'll be responding quite often in this thread, so it's probably a good idea to have that open and ready for during the lecture time. Okay, yeah, let's jump right into it. So today we're going to be talking about the React lifecycle. And most of what we do today will be in the context of class components, and because they have specific lifecycle methods that we're going to be talking about. But I do want to start by going over the React lifecycle as it pertains to hooks. So any React component, whether it's functional or class, stateful or not, the React lifecycle is happening on both ends, no matter what kind of component you have, and whether it has state or not. So let me find a good place to do this. We're going to go through a little drawing here. I need some white space. There we go. Okay, this will work. All right, we have our application. We have our app component here. We've got some kind of component tree happening like this. This one's going to go down deep. This one's going to go out here, and it's going to render something based on like a dot map. So it's going to dynamically render all of these components here. So the render cycle, the life cycle of a component, means that every component that is on the screen is going to go through this life cycle. And it's going to go through 3 phases. It's going to go through a mounting phase. Then it is going to go through the rendering, re-rendering. We'll call this re-render. And then the unmounting phase where it dies. Rip our component. Unmount. So let's pretend that these are all, not views, we'll call these routes. So usually what happens is our app is going to define a bunch of routes. And when we navigate to those paths in our URL, we're going to render one of these component trees, right? So let's say this is our home route, and we're rendering this when our app opens up. Well, each of these components is going to be mounted to the DOM and is going to render whatever JSX we return from that component. So as we mount our components, a couple things happen. If we're in a functional component, then we're going to run any effects that are listed in that route, right? Every effect that we have in our component is going to run as our component is mounting to the DOM. Well, with class components, we don't have the effect hook, right? We've got class lifecycle methods. So when our component mounts, if it's a class component, what's going to happen is a lifecycle method called component_did_mount is going to run, and that function will run whatever code it has inside of it. Let's see. We know that these are routes. We're just going to delete that. Now, the hard part with classes is when our component re-renders, we can't just run component_did_mount again, right? With the effect hook, it's really easy. We say, if there's no dependencies, if our effects are not dependent on any piece of data, that's just going to run every single time that our component re-renders. But with classes, the component_did_mount only runs one time when the component is actually mounting. So inside component_did_render, or when our component renders and re-renders based on some data changes, we have to write an entirely new function called component_did_update. I'm shortening these, but we'll see them in just a second, to run our effects again. So we actually have to keep track of all of our effects in two different component lifecycle methods when we're using classes. So one of the reasons that hooks have become so popular is this gets really confusing and hard to maintain when you've got the same logic happening inside different functions based on different parts of your component lifecycle. And then, of course, when we unmount, when our component dies, whatever's returned from our effect hook will run, or we can use component will unmount to run whatever cleanup we have to do. Okay, we'll get to all of this. What I want to talk about is this re-render cycle. So let's say that we get to this route here and we've got some state, and we'll call this state A. So we're managing state A here, and state A is our list of data that we're mapping over to pass down to all of these components, to dynamically render all of these components. So we've taken state A here, probably fetched this data from a API, pass it down as props. This component maps through this list of data and passes each piece of data as a prop down to each of these components. So what happens if we change this state here? What happens if we fetch new data inside our component_did_update, or maybe we click a button and we get a new list of data? Let's say this is like a pagination thing. So you've got a list of 10 things that you've rendered dynamically down here, and then you click the next button, and it refetches data and re-renders 10 new things, right? So we've changed state A. Well, what happens is as we update state, as we run set state here, we update our state, then this component is going to go through a re-render. We're going to do this in green. I'm going to say re-render. So any state changes will cause this component, will cause a component to re-render. And this doesn't matter if you're in function components or class components. If you've got use state inside a function component and you run a setter function for that state, your component is going to re-render. If you've got a class component with some state in it and you run this.setState, that component is going to re-render. Okay, so any state changes automatically trigger this component to re-render. Now, what does that mean? Re-render. That scares a lot of React developers, thinking, oh man, if I run too many state updates, then I'm not going to have very good performance because I'm putting this all on the DOM and changing it, and this re-render is going to be really slow. Now, that's not actually true. Re-renders are fine. Re-rendering your component is okay. Because what happens is, just when a component re-renders, it doesn't necessarily redraw what's on the DOM. It will only redraw the nodes on the DOM, which is the tough on performance part, right? Redrawing, repainting DOM nodes. That's what really takes a lot of computing power. React is smart enough to know exactly which nodes on the DOM need to be redrawn, repainted. And just because a component is going through this re-render cycle doesn't mean that it's going to repaint everything on the DOM. It's only looking for what nodes have changed, and that's what it's going to repaint on the DOM. So a lot of developers get into this idea of, oh, every single time my component re-renders, it's going to hurt my performance. That's not usually true. Okay, so we run set state, we get a new list. That causes this component to re-render and all of its children components to re-render. Now, when this component here re-renders, it's going to get new data via props. So if there's any props changes, when our props change, that's also going to cause our component to re-render. So our props are going to change. This component's going to re-render. Same with all of these children components because their props are now changing as well. And again, this is the same for function and class components. Okay, anytime your state within your component changes, anytime your props change, your component is going to re-render. And all of its children components are going to re-render. So keep that in mind. And then once we know that, once we understand that our components are going to re-render, we have to know what's going to happen when when we go through this cycle, this re-render cycle. So with function components, we're going to run all of our effects if our state and if that effect depends on that particular state that changed, or if our effect depends on that particular prop that changed. Then we're going to run that effect again. We're also going to run all of our use state calls just to make sure they are up to date. So use state will be called, the effects will call if their dependency changed, and then whatever we return in our JSX will run again as well. In our class components, we actually have defined class methods defined functions, lifecycle methods that are going to run when we re-render our component. So let's go look at those right now. So if we go up here, this is a good visual to see what's happening. There's actually a better one now. Component. Nope, let me grab this real quick. Give me 1 second. Once we look at this, we'll do questions and a break. Nope, that wasn't it. Let's go here. Yeah, here's all my notes. Let's see, we want this one. Okay. This is much better because you can actually uncheck this and it'll take away all of the less common life cycles. So these are the ones that we're really going to talk about today. All the ones that disappear when we uncheck this, like get derived state from props, ship component update, get snapshot, all of that you hardly ever use. I've actually never used any of those in my entire career. So like really, this is what we need, what we're going to focus on. So let me give you this here. Okay, so what happens when a class component mounts? The constructor is going to be the first thing that runs. And inside our constructor, we know that we're initializing our state. And if we're doing that weird binding stuff, because you, for some reason, aren't using arrow functions, that's going to run in our constructor as well. So our constructor runs, and oh, what's cool about this too is you can click on any of these and it takes you to the docs for it. So you'll notice that the constructor only runs one time while in this mounting phase. So as our component is mounting, our constructor is running. Once our constructor runs and initializes our state, then we run the render function that we saw yesterday. And we render our JSX to the DOM, React updates the DOM and the refs, and then component did mount runs. So component did mount, as we talked about earlier here, now it's a mess. So component did mount is where we run our side effects that we need to run for our component when our component is mounting. For example, this would be for something like fetch initial data. So if we need to make an API call in this component, and we want to do that as the component's mounting, then this is where component did mount is where we first do that. This is also where we set up event listeners and timers. So if you've ever tried to do like a set timeout in a React app, it's a little bit tough, right? You actually have to set it up inside component did mount and then clean it up inside component will unmount. Okay, so our constructor runs, our render function runs, component did mount runs. Inside component did mount, we're going to set up initial data or fetch our initial data. and also set up some side effects that we possibly want to run in this component. Then we get to the updating phase. Now, this is just kind of a place where our app is just waiting until new props or new state, until we run set state or we receive new props in that component. Once either of those things happen, then we go through the render function, we update the DOM, and we can run a new lifecycle method called componented update. This one is to, inside componented update, we're going to fetch additional data. Data based on the state or props changes. So this is a lot like the use effect hook, where we're going to check to see if a certain piece of state changed, then we run some kind of side effect. Or if a certain prop changed, we're going to run some kind of side effect. Okay, this is, so componented update is where you would put the same kind of side effect logic that you would use inside use effect. And then once componented update runs, we come back up here waiting for something else to happen to trigger new props or to run set state again and go through this whole cycle again. And this happens over and over and over again, and then finally our component dies. So when our component is unmounting, we run one final function here called component will unmount, where we clean up any of these event listeners or timers that we started in component did update. So this is where we do our cleanup again, similar to the return callback inside the effect hook. Okay, that was a lot of words at you. Let's look at some questions and take a break, and then we'll see this in actual code, and it will make a lot more sense. Do I prefer Axios or Fetch for getting data? I still prefer Axios. Our program manager, Dan Levy, has a good article on this, on why you may not need Axios. So I'll give you this as an opposing view here. Great article. He wrote this almost a year ago. So yeah, just showing you with examples and documentation of how you can use Fetch rather than Axios if you want to go that way. Great question. I'm trying to put this in layman's terms for myself. So the constructor is used to set up the state and tell the app we want to take in information. Not necessarily that we want to take in information, just that we're setting up state properties. Updating, rendering is when we process new data that we could adjust the state. Unmounting completes the newly updated state. Not quite. This, I think, on these two parts here, you're a little bit off. We'll go over it a little bit more, but the idea is that mounting means your component is being, for the first time, going to be put onto the screen. It's going to be on the DOM itself. So your component, when it's mounting, is coming to the DOM. And so we use our constructor to set up state for that. Updating, this phase here is is the life of your component in the browser. So as your component is mounted on the DOM, as it is displaying data on the screen here, it's going to go through this re-render cycle over and over and over again as we change state or as we change props. Unmounting is really it being pulled off of the DOM. Now, when a component is pulled off of the DOM, no longer displaying here. So let's say we're at in our trinket shop, and we're looking at our list of trinkets on the screen. When we click into one of those, we're changing routes, and we're no longer rendering our shop list component. So our shop list component would then unmount, and it would not be on anywhere on the screen, anywhere on the DOM. So it would go through this unmounting phase, and if we had any event listeners or timers, we would need to clean up those side effects inside component did mount here. So that's more, I want you to think of this more as like the entire life cycle of a component. When it's born, its entire life, and when it dies. By the way, I know we didn't talk about this. There's a good reason for that. Let's see. Normally, you should try to avoid all uses of force update. So don't ever use force update, basically. That's straight from the React team. Draw. We just talk about props and set state, not force update. Okay, great question. Please, if that's still confusing in any way, over the next little bit, ask again. I think going through the example in code is going to make a lot more sense. So yeah, let me know if there's anything still confusing with that. If you need query select elements or get elements by, would you use that? Okay, good question. And when we're doing React, when we're building React apps, we shouldn't do anything like query select or get elements by. We should very rarely be touching the DOM ourselves. We should never do any manual queries or get elements. We should let React handle all of our DOM updates and interact with the DOM itself. We're not going to interact with the DOM. So these would actually, if you do need to interact with a DOM node, then you would do it with something called refs. You can look up the use ref hook, and you can look up refs in the documentation. But you should not be, if you're ever doing this inside a React element, then you are doing React not as it was intended to be done. So React takes care of all of our DOM manipulation for us, except in those very few instances that you may need to set up a ref, which is a reference to a DOM node inside your component. There's good reasons for setting up refs. Scroll events, like if you need to check to see if you're at the bottom of a scroll of a scroll table or something, a scrollable element, then that's when you would need a reference to that element, so you know if you've scrolled to the bottom and need to load more data or something. But they're very few and far in between that you need refs. Usually you can get by without directly manipulating the DOM in most cases. Okay, awesome questions. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll actually open up some code stuff. Woo! I'll see you back in 5. Okay, come on back to your seats. All right, we're going to be referring to this chart, drawing, visual, our visual aid here, as we go through this next step. Let me bring Slack back over here. Okay, so we're gonna start with this list of Pokemon cards. Someday I'll go through and actually make these look more like Pokemon cards. But hey, it's a good start, right? Let me give you this. So this is where we'll be at for a little bit here. We're going to go through the different life cycle methods. And yeah. So already we have our constructor pulled up here. And we're getting our Pokemon data from this import right here. So we're initializing our state with some imported data from this data file. Well, usually our apps aren't going to have a data file. Usually we're going to be getting this data from an async function and getting this data from an API, right? So instead of setting our state with this data imported from a file, we're usually going to initialize this as an empty array. So we initialize this as an empty array. And then where are we going, what method are we going to use to set our data to Pokemon? So this is a question that you jump into this thread and answer the question here. So what are we going to do? How are we going to get our data back into on our state here? Yeah, component did mount. Awesome. Also could be component did mount, like that. You'll see developers are lazy, so we often do things like that. Component did mount, component did update, component will unmount. Yeah. Okay, so component did mount. So to introduce component did mount here, this comes from React.component. This doesn't, we don't import this like we do the effect hook or other hook functions. This is actually part of our class already. We just need to pull it up here, say component did mount, and you can write this either way and it will be already bound to this component. You could do it like this, or you could do it as an arrow function. With component lifecycle methods, doesn't matter either way. What is going on? There we go. You'll usually see them in this format here. So that's what we'll do. All right, inside our component did mount, this is to fetch initial data and set up listeners and timers. Right now, we're just going to mock fetching initial data. So let's pretend we are fetching our data, and inside the dot then we're going to say this dot set state, and we want to update our Pokemon state with whatever data we fetched. So now you'll notice that we've got our Pokemon back up. Hooray! So let's do this. We're going to say, just like we console logged up here that the constructor is running, we're going to console log here that component did mount is running and fetching Pokemon data. Okay, so let's open up our console and see what's going on. So what happens here is our constructor runs. Constructor is running. Our constructor runs, and then this console log is coming from inside Pokemon. So we're console logging our props. So here's our props object. We've got props.pokemon. And you'll notice the first time that this component renders, we have an empty array. And then we run through component did mount after our render. So let's console log that we're rendering as well. Console log rendering. That was, I don't know where that came from. Rendering. There we go. All right. So our constructor runs, our render function runs, Pokemon, the Pokemon component mounts and console logs the props. Then our component did mount after the render cycle is all finished for that entire component tree. Then we run component did mount. And you see that we're fetching Pokemon data. Now, why is this console log happening again? What happens after we do this console log that triggers this console log again? Yeah, we're updating state. So jump into this thread if you want to answer. It's pinned. It's on this message here. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what happens is we got all the way through these, right? We came all the way down here. We started running our component did mount. Inside our component did mount, we ran this .set state. So that triggers the render function again when we update our state. And that's why we're getting this console log to refire and this console log to refire. Okay, let's add component did update. Oh, I'm mixing, there we go. And let's just run console.log. When do you think component did update? When are we going to see this console log? So take your best guess, put it in Slack here. When do you think we're going to see this console log happen on this list here? After the render, after it renders again, after state changes, re-render. Yeah, really good. Those are all correct. Once we run, oh, didn't mean to click on it. Once we run our set state and we re-render our component, the DOM is going to update and then this function is going to run. So let me ask you this. Let's get a little more specific. Is it going to run after or before this last console log? So either before, right in between rendering ... and this console log, or right after. What do you think? It'll be at the very bottom after. After. Everybody's saying after. John says before. Let's go see. John's sticking with it. Oh, Mauricio's there too. Okay, console.log. Component did update. Running. Aha, at the very end. Now, John, the reason that this is happening at the very end is the render cycle for all the children components is going to happen before we get to these green lifecycle methods here. So you'll notice that right before we get to these green lifecycle methods at the bottom, we're updating the DOM and refs, which causes the children components to update and render first. So it kind of goes, it works from the outside in and then from the inside out. It works from the outside in on this part, on the render part here, so that it can update the DOM, and then it works from the top to the bottom here, and then it updates the DOM, working from top to bottom. Then it goes from bottom to top, running these lifecycle methods until it gets back up to the component that had the state change or the props change. Which is why rendering to state is always behind 1 if you're not doing it after. Yep, yes. Okay. So we've got all of our render consoles happening. By the way, we don't teach this anymore, but if you'd like to learn about prop types, it's not a bad thing to learn. This is a good code sandbox, a good app to use to learn prop types. So feel free to learn about, check out prop types and learn about that if you'd like to jump into those. Cool. Let's see. Let's go ahead and jump into questions. I really like this visualization of the console logs. You can see exactly what's happening as we're updating data and as we're fetching data. Remember, usually this is going to be wrapped inside a .then from an API call, these set state calls. But yeah, let's see if there's any questions before we actually build something out with this and talk through it more. Okay, part in the TK says this .set state is not directly part of the life cycle, but influences it. What does it mean by influences the life cycle? Basically what that's talking about is that it will trigger your component to re-render. So it's not technically a lifecycle method, but it does trigger these other lifecycle methods to run, render and component update. So all of these blue and green boxes here are lifecycle methods. Yellow is what's happening under the hood that React is doing. And then these are just what's happening as different events are occurring in your app. Okay, good question. Wow, move zoom tools. They won't stay in one place. When updating state, would you use CDU for handling, storing the latest state changes? For example, storing the data in local storage. I think that's pretty, what's the word? It really depends on the situation, pretty situational. So let's see, componented update. Yeah, I think that's a good place for storing the latest state changes. Because when we get to, we'll see this in a little bit, but when we use componented update has access. This happens after set state finishes updating the state and after we've received new props. So if you're inside a componented update, let's say we want a console.log this.state.pokemon, we're always going to see the latest list of Pokemon here. So CDU is running, we see the latest state inside componented update. Or if we had props, we would see the latest props as well. So yeah, that's a good place to handle that. Okay, let's take another break, and we'll be back in 5 minutes, and we're going to build a fun doggos app with all of these lifecycle methods. So I'll see you back in 5. Okay, come on back. All right, as we're going through all of this today, again, I know we're focusing on class components, but I want you to remember that this same life cycle pattern, the same cycle here, is happening, mounting, updating, and unmounting, is happening in functional components as well. For example, if we go to the Pokemon component, and let's see, we have to update our React dependencies to get hooks here. We can do something like use effect. And we can say every time that props.pokemon changes with console log, let's move this console log into there. This is going to tell us not to do props. Destructure Pokemon from our props. Oh, that's what it was saying. Okay. So the idea here is that no matter if you're in a functional component or a class component using hooks or this.state, etc., this life cycle is still going to be happening. And so this console log happens when this component mounts and anytime props.pokemon changes. So here it is when it mounts. Here it is. It's console logging twice. Let's see if it does that every time. Yeah, it looks like it. So just be aware that as we're talking about this in the context of classes, this also, all of these apply, not the methods here, but the process, the re-rendering process still applies to functional components. Okay, let's take a look at this in a real world example. I don't know who the human is that wrote this app, but it's pretty cool and a good example of this. So here's this app. Let's take a look at what it does. So this is mapping all of the earthquakes with a minimum magnitude and a specific date range. So let's just look at the last week. Let's go from the 24th to today. You'll probably be surprised at how many earthquakes happen on a weekly basis. Look at that. That's how many earthquakes within the last week have happened with a minimum magnitude of 3. Let's try 6. Wow, still like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's crazy. Anyways, not part of our lecture here, but crazy nonetheless, right? Okay, so let's take a look at how this app was built. So we've got this app component that is rendering earthquakes container. So let's go to earthquakes container inside components, and let's take a look at what earthquakes container is. Well, we've got some state. Ooh, and look at this. A little bit of shortcut here. If you're not doing any binding inside your constructor, you actually can skip writing out the constructor and just set your state like this. So there's a little shortcut for you. So here's our state. We've got Quakes as state. Now we've got, when our component mounts, we're going to run this fetch Quakes function. And then inside our .then, we're going to set our state with our data. Okay, so just like before, we initialize our state. This happens in the constructor, just under the hood now. But just know that even though this isn't wrapped in a constructor, it really happens inside the constructor. That just happens under the hood now. So our constructor runs, initializes our state. Once the component renders, then we fetch our Quakes. And once that comes back inside our .then, we're going to run this .set state. So there was this question here that Katie answered. This is what it normally looks like. So sorry that was confusing. What I meant was we're going to run some kind of fetch function, and then inside the .then is where we're going to run this .set state and set our data to our state. Okay, so let's see where we're using this .state.quakes. So we passed this .state.quakes down to earthquakes map. So let's go check out earthquakes map. Okay, so earthquakes map in the render is loading a map here, a div with a map on it. And you'll notice the reference here, because when you're working with Google Map, you have to take a node to put the map on. So you find some DOM node that you can put this map on. And that's what the reference is for. It will, let's find where it's actually building the map. Where is, this .map refers to this div. So this .refs.map, this .map equals a new map. We're putting that on the map ref. Anyways, so when this starts out, when this first renders, we're just going to render loading map. So as you click here, you'll notice the loading map right here in the top corner happens really fast because we get our data back really fast. But as soon as we get our data back, when we get our Quakes data, we run this function here. So let me close this so we can see this here. So inside our componented mount, this is going to be similar to use effect, but a little bit different. Let's actually drop this down here. We have to manually check for certain props or state changes. No dependency array in componented update, sad face. So componented update is similar to use effect in that when this is actually going to run on every single props or state changes. And it's going to take in two properties, previous props and previous state. And then we have to manually check for certain props or state changes. So what this if statement is doing is making sure that Google is there, and then also checking every time our Quakes props changes. So it looks at our previous props that had come into this component before the re-render, and it's looking at the new props. So if our previous props are not the same as our new props, that means that our Quakes data has changed, and we run this.load map. In fact, if you look at this, every time you click submit here, every time you click submit, let's just look at today. We probably won't get anything for today. Every time you click submit, you'll notice that the entire map is going to reload, right? So there, in the last 24 hours, lots of earthquakes. So kind of an interesting way to do this. I wouldn't personally reload the map every single time. There's other ways to do this with Google Maps, but it is a really good way to see component did update. Every time that we change our quakes data and run this we run this load map here. So yeah, kind of a cool little project to look through, but not as cool as building our own project. So let's build our own, very own project here. Cranky Lamport. I love the random URLs they come up with. Okay, so for the rest of this, we are going to, I'm gonna have you help me build out this project. So we're gonna change this to a class first of all. So jump on here, we're gonna change this to a class, like so, extends react.component. We're gonna do the state shortcut. We're gonna have some state called doggos. That's gonna be an empty array. And then when you're changing from a function to a class component, you need to wrap your return in a render function. That's the one. Okay, so go ahead and get your index.js component or your app component set up in a class like this. And then I'm going to have you help me build this Doggos app. Okay, now that we've got that set up, we want to, when this component mounts, we want to fetch some data. So I'm going to bring this over here, shrink it down a little bit, about like that. No, don't move the whole screen, just do that, there we go. Okay, so we're gonna play driver navigator, woohoo! How this works is you are all gonna talk me through the steps of building this app out. So I'll ask you for next steps, we'll kind of go through it. Now the rule of the game is you get one chance to offer a reply here. Okay, once you've typed out the next step and posted on here, you can't post anymore. We want to get as many people involved in this as we can. So if you're one of the students that does not like to post things and participate, you're the one I want to hear from most of all. Okay, so think through try to just post at least once. Try to post on here, especially if you normally don't interact and post during lecture time. Okay, so what is my first step here going to be? Yeah, component mount. Nice. And this makes it pretty easy if you normally don't like doing this. Once you see someone answer, just give the same answer. So, but please, okay, everybody that posted here, you're no longer allowed to post anymore. So we're gonna say component did mount. Ah, I did it again. Oh man, there we go. All right, and Eric said we're going to fetch our data. So what are we gonna do to fetch our data? We're actually gonna stick with Axios since that's what we know. Yeah, we're gonna do an Axios call, axios.get, and then we're going to, as Gavin said, set state inside our Axios call. So let's add a dependency, Axios, and then we're going to import Axios from Axios, and we'll do axios.get. All right, so let's go see. Mouse, there we go. Here's the endpoint. Let's put it inside there. I'll post this here for you as well. So that's our endpoint. So we're gonna get a list of Husky images. Now you can put different breeds in here. We'll play around with that in just a minute. Inside our den, inside our .then, we're going to always, always, always console log our res, so we can see what our data looks like that we have available to us inside here. And then we're going to console log the dot or the console log . All right, so let's open this up. And I'm going to open it up in a new window. And we should have fetched our data. Ah, here it is, res.data. Res.data.message is an array of images. So each element in the array is just a URL, image URL. So res.data.message is my data. So what am I going to do inside my .then? How am I going to set my data for doggos? Okay, we're going to run this.set state. Then what? Ooh, close. Closer. Which property are we trying to update? There we go. So we're trying to update our doggos. I know it. Hooks throw you off on this. That's okay. Hooks are better anyways. Okay, so doggos is going to equal res.data.message. So now we come here. We can go to our component dev tools. We can click on map, and there's our state. Cool, so we've got our state. Let's go ahead and render our state. So I'm going to give you all of this. Here's what you can put inside your render function, inside the return. Hey, there's our doggos. Look at those cute dogs. Huskies are awesome. We just got a yellow lab. I've always wanted a husky, and then I realized how much they shed. our lab's been shedding too, but not nearly as much as a husky would. But yeah, look at these huskies. Again, you can kind of play with the breeds here. We could say boxer, and it would fetch us a list of boxers with the hat. That's awesome. Okay, great job. Yeah, we built out our componented mount. Again, this would be really similar to use effect, right? So if we were building out a use effect, let's do some comments here. If we were doing this in a functional component, we would do something like, for now, we're just gonna do this when the component mounts. We're not gonna have this synchronized with any data. So we would do all of this inside here. And we wouldn't do set state, right? If this was a functional component, we would just say set doggos to res.data.message. So this is what we're used to. This is how we do it with classes. Energy level differences too. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at questions. This was really, really awesome. Good job on fetching this initial data. We're going to come back and we're going to make it so we can type in a different breed here and click fetch and get a new breed of images, or images of a different breed. But yeah, let's take a look at questions and then we'll come back and we'll work on that part. How do you know if you're not going to be using binding right away? Because any, I think we're going to be doing like a fetch doggos function here. So any class method that I define that's not these lifecycle methods, I'm going to define as an arrow function. Then I never have to use a constructor and I never have to do binding. I can just do this shorthand state object and I never have to worry about binding. So if you use an arrow function, you don't have to worry about that. When you write the componented mount method, does that mean you're overriding the original componented mount? That is a good question. So what happens here is we're defining this method and then React calls this method. So there's not like an original componented mount that does anything inside of it. React just looks for app.componented mount and will call that function in the right place. And soon we're going to see componented update, and it will call that lifecycle method in the right order in this rendering cycle. What is the point of componented update? Why do we even have it? I'll show you that in just a minute. We're going to see that in the next part of our lecture. The componented update can run multiple times, unlike componented mount. Yes, great observation. So componented mount is only going to run once when the component mounts, right? Because we go through all of this once, and then we automatically circle back up to here. But everything inside here is going to circle around and around and around again, and going to run over and over and over again every time we receive new props or update our state. Then when the component mounts, component will unmount only runs once. So render is going to run a lot, and componented update is going to run a lot. Constructor, CDM, and CWU are only going to run once. When would you want to load data in the constructor versus loading it in componented mount? Usually you're not going to load data in the constructor. You're just going to set up your state properties like this. Some people get tempted to do something like some data this dot props dot some data. However, this now gives you two places that you're managing the same data. So wherever this data is coming from, it's being managed in a higher up component. And now you're managing it in this state object as well. So it's easy for these to get out of sync. So I would caution you against doing this. So usually you're actually not going to load data in the constructor in your state object. It's always going to come from component in mount. Or if you're getting data from props, just use it on props. Don't put it on state. Okay, let's take our last break, and I'll see you back in 5. All right, come on back to your computers. Okay, so we just built this fun little app that fetches dog pictures from the dogs.ceo, dog.ceo API. Now we want to make it so that we can type in a different breed here and fetch doggos of that breed. So we've got an input that is being controlled by this.state.doggo text. But actually it's not being controlled because we don't have this.state.doggo text and we don't have handle changes. So let's add a new state property, doggo text, and we'll start this off as husky because that's the first breed that we're fetching. So now we should have husky in there, and we see images of huskies. But we can't change this yet because we don't have a handle changes function. So let's go ahead and create our handle changes. This is going to take in an event. Set state. We're going to update our doggo text. Now, if we had multiple inputs that we wanted to update, we could do name equals doggo text, and then we could change this to event.target.name and event.target.value. Either way is fine. We don't necessarily need to do that with just one input, so I'm just going to be a little more declarative on what is being changed here. All right, so make sure to add your handle changes. Make sure you add doggo text inside your state object. I'll leave handle changes up here for a second. Now we've got this button here, and when we click this button, we're going to run this function right here, fetch doggos. So the first thing we want to do, since this is a button click, is run event.prevent default. And then we want to fetch new doggo images based on the input text. And then we want to update state with the new doggo images array. Okay, this is where we're going to differ a little bit from functional components. So normally we would want to run this in an effect hook like this and just say that this is based on some state changes, refetch our doggos. But in a class component without hooks, we're just going to do this inside a function. So we're going to say axios.get, and we're going to grab this string here. Actually, don't grab the don't grab those because we're going to do this in an interpolated string. And we're going to say our breed is not going to be hard-coded. It's going to come from what? Okay, if you haven't answered, where are we getting our dog breed here? Yes. Joe, you've answered before. Cheater. I'm taking Robert's answer. You're good, you're good. This.state.doggo text. Perfect. Yay, Destiny. Hi, Destiny. All right. So we're not hard coding the dog image here. We are going to fetch our new array of images based on what's inside our input text. So we'll say .then res. We already know what's coming back. We're going to do the same state call here because it's the same. We're going to get the same data. Catch. We'll catch an error. And console.log the error. Okay, so let's see what happens. This should, since we're calling set state inside here, we expect our app to re-render and update our DOM, right? So let's go here. We're going to say boxer. Fetch doggos. Hey, there's our boxers. Wait, was there a boxer in boxers? I swear I just saw that somewhere up here. Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if those are boxers or just shorts. That's awesome. We have one problem though. And this is kind of a big problem. Someone could come in here and fetch images of chihuahuas. And we don't want that. Refresh fast. No chihuahuas here. So we need to make sure that we're not fetching chihuahua images. So we're going to set up component did update. And again, component did update takes in previous props and previous state. Similar to how we set up dependencies inside an effect hook, we need to look to see which data has changed here. So inside the effect hook, the dependency array looks at a piece of state or a piece of prop that's changed, right? Component did update, we're going to do the same thing, but again, we have to do it manually. So we're going to say if this.state.doggos is different than our previous state.doggos, then we need to do something. Block chihuahua images. All right, here we go. What are we going to do? How do we block chihuahua images? Well, we can say if this.state.doggo text equals chihuahua, then we're going to basically do all of this again. There are ways to optimize this, maybe pull this out into a function. A lot of not dry code happening here, but just for the sake of example, we're going to copy and paste our Axios call. So if we get chihuahuas, we want to hurry and fetch husky images, which means we want to change our doggo text back to husky. Okay, so let's go try this out. Did we successfully, oh, that was the right one. Did we successfully block chihuahuas? Let's try boxer, fetch, okay. Chihuahua. Phew, okay, we did it. No fetching chihuahuas. By the way, of course, I'm just kidding. I have had one student who has the love of her life, like 2 or 3 chihuahuas. That got very upset at me. Just know that I'm kidding. I love all forms of life, including Chihuahuas. This is just a fun example. So if you have Chihuahuas, I would love to see pictures of your Chihuahuas. All right, no yippy dogs. I'll send you a picture of our puppy after we're done in class today. So how would we do this in use effect? If we were doing use effect, I would probably do something like const doggos, set doggos equals use state, initialize it with an empty array. I like to keep this with the effect that's managing it, or that is going to be manipulating it. So up here, I'm going to do doggo text, set doggo text equals use state, and initialize that as husky. But watch this. So how do we, yes, there are pets channels, yeah. How do we give this a dependency to make this Axios call run when some of these things happen? Like, how do we mimic this this component did update? How do we mimic this fetch doggos? Well, we need to give this some kind of dependency that we can change when we click on our fetch doggos button, right? Your first inclination is to set your dependency as doggos, but you're setting doggos. You're not depending. This call doesn't depend on what's in doggos. It sets doggos. So there's a cool pattern that's come out. I'm going to cut that I really like, that I'll share with you right now. If we do const URL, set URL, use state, and do an interpolated string here, and then set this to our doggo text, and then pass in URL here. Well, the first time this component mounts, it's going to fetch huskies, right? We've set doggo text to huskies. We run this effect. It grabs the URL and gets our huskies. So we're going to say that this effect depends on what our URL is. So anytime we run set URL, we're going to rerun this entire effect. So for example, later on in our code, we've got fetch doggos. And this is a function, take an event, runs event.prevent default. Then it's going to set URL. Well, first it's got to, oh yeah, whatever's in doggo text has been updated by our input. So we can just give it this string again, and it will grab the updated doggo text. So when we set, let's say we typed in boxer here into our input, and then hit enter or hit our fetch doggos button, it's going to set our URL, which changes URL, which runs this effect, and it's going to run our Axios call again and set our doggos with our new URL. And we can even do this with if doggo text does not equal Chihuahua, we run that. Else, if it does equal Chihuahua, we're going to set URL, and we're just going to hard code husky, and then set doggo text back to Husky. So I want you to look at this. This is all we have to do inside a functional component with hooks to get everything that we just did. With classes, we have to set our state, we have to run component did mount, we have to run component did update, and we have to run fetch doggos. So a whole lot more code here inside class components than you need with hooks. But I think it's good to see it side by side so you can kind of understand what each of these is doing. And remember, just like class components, anytime you set state, update your state, you're going to re-render your component. Now, on that line, this is the last thing I'll talk about. And then we'll look at questions and go over the project for this afternoon. There are a couple really good blogs. So if you look up Kent C. Dodd's blog and go to his blog, I highly recommend reading through his blog posts. They're absolutely amazing. He's a fantastic teacher. He has some very specific blog posts on the lifecycle method, on re-renders, and how to make sure that your apps are optimized. So let's see, not that one. I want this one first. Which one do we want? Okay, so this one first. So fix the slow render before you fix the re-render. So again, every time we get new props and we call set update, we're going to re-render that entire componentry, right? And again, that's not a bad thing. A lot of people kind of jump to fixing re-renders before they fix the slow render. So if your app is slow, it's probably because the component that you're rendering is rendering slowly. It's not because you're re-rendering over and over and over again. That's usually not the problem. So there's one. You don't have to go through these. They are probably going to be a little more advanced. This one looks like it's going to be pretty good though. Another one is if you do need to optimize your React re-renders. So fix the slow render first, but if your re-rendering is the problem, then maybe you do have to optimize that. So there's that one. And then just kind of a bonus one, which is good for all new React developers, when to break up components into multiple components. Anyways, he's got a ton of blog posts. He's been writing consistently on a weekly basis for over 2 years now. So he's got blog posts for every week for the last 2 years. They're all super fantastic. I highly suggest. At the bottom, you can sign up for his newsletter. Then you get an email every time he writes a new blog. Follow him on Twitter. Yeah. Okay. I kind of do the fanboy thing when talking about Kent C. Dodds. He's awesome. All right, let's take a look at our project for today, and then I'll look at any last questions that have come in. So our project today is going to be the React GitHub user card. So you're going to be rebuilding your GitHub user card project, but this time with React. You're going to use class components, and you're going to be fetching data, initial data, and component did mount. If you want to click on one of your followers and get their data, you're going to use component did update. Where is it? So you're going to be using component lifecycle methods to create this project. The steps are through here. And then stretch problems, of course, as usual. Once you're done with MVP, work on stretch problems here. You can reference your old project. That's totally fine. I don't think that's a problem at all. Okay, that's the project for today. Let's see if there were any other questions, and then we'll call it a day. Do you often use the CDM and CDU functions in code? Yeah, all the time. One example I gave your TLs this morning is, let's say you have an app that displays a profile page of like users or customers, and you've got a list of customers on the side here. Let's say you can click on customers and it shows their data in the profile on the main page. You would use componented update every time you click on a new customer to fetch that new customer's data. So your component isn't, your profile component out here isn't remounting, right? You're just fetching new data and re-rendering your component with that new data. So yeah, you'll use componented update and componented mount all the time in classes. Hopefully you get to write new code and hooks when you've got a job, but that kind of depends on the company you get hired at. When we use set state or brief state more, brief state is used in componented update. Set state is used inside these different functions. So again, the blue and green boxes here, these are component methods, and then everything else, these are functions, or these are events that happen, something that happens. You've set state, or you've get new props in your component that cause these functions to run. Usually inside componented mount is when you're going to call this dot set state. So here's our componented mount. We're calling this dot set state. Just like the effect hook, we're calling a setter function to set our newly fetched data to state. So don't conflate these as the same things. These have different functionalities than both of these. Yesterday we had CCR as a guide to set classes. Today we're told we don't need to call constructor. Why so? Oftentimes we kind of show you the longer way so that you know what's happening under the hood. So there's been a lot of changes in the last 4 years in JavaScript that give us shortcuts to all this, to a lot of things that we do. It's really good to learn what's happening behind those shortcuts though. So yeah, yesterday you set up your classes with a constructor. Today I showed you the shortcut pattern to not use a constructor if you don't need it. But I want you to know that if you set up your state like this, you really are calling a constructor. That's important for you to know and realize that that's happening behind the scenes. For cleaning up the event listeners and component to will unmount, do we just need to be resetting our state back to initial state? Oh, we don't, you don't set up, you don't change state in componented mount. Let's say we had, in here, if we had like window dot add event listener, resize this dot handle resize. Let's say we set up an event listener. What we do inside component will unmount is remove that listener. Window dot remove event listener, resize, and this dot handle resize. So the component will unmount, you're not going to be setting state inside here. You're just cleaning up anything that needs to be cleaned up. So none of this needs to be cleaned up. Event listeners do need to be cleaned up. You need to remove those event listeners when the component unmounts. Okay, do you have any libraries you would recommend for class components for styling? styling is going to be the exact same as you've done up to this point. So there's not any difference with class components when it comes to styling, when it comes to like receiving props, mapping over arrays, things like that. So, so yeah, there's not much that changes with class components other than this keyword and having access to these lifecycle methods. Of course, these lifecycle methods are now can be replaced by hooks, which is really nice. All right, the way code set up dogs with 2 words, and yes, you need to go to dog.ceo and look up how to, so if you go to dog API, then documentation. So here's the list of dogs. Let's see, browse breed list. There's somewhere that shows us breed list. You might have to even open up the network tab. And look at the request. So cattle dog dash Australian is how you need to. So yeah, this isn't great because then you'd have to say cattle dog dash Australian. You have to type it in perfect for it to fetch the correct. I probably did it wrong. Yeah, it's probably getting errors here. Read not found. So yeah, it's not a perfect example, but you can go to dog.ceo and read through the documentation to see how to, by subbreed maybe. To see how to do that better. So yeah, this one just shows hound / Afghan. All right, cool. We went a little bit over time. Sorry about that. Mostly because I wanted to build this out so you can see the example of both of those together. But yeah, have a wonderful day working on your GitHub card project, and I will see you all tomorrow.